Hello, and welcome to Replay Value. Hyouka episode 20 is what I'd consider the setup episode for the finale, in that if you weren't paying attention to status in the previous episodes, it's going to be thrown in your face just to make sure that you're up to speed. In this way, I'd consider it the least important episode in the show. Sorry, episode 6, you can come back into the lineup. I gave you an unfair shake because I was comparing you to episode 5. Especially because episode 20 has what I'd consider the worst mystery in the show from a structural perspective. But we'll talk a bit about why it's actually really satisfying thematically. For the record, the fact that I would argue that episode 20 is the worst episode in the show's run is unreal, because it's still very, very good. It brings up some really interesting realities about status that haven't really been addressed previously, has the great animation that one would expect, and fundamentally, if you love the characters, it's another great 25 minutes with them. But it's best if we just break it down, so we're going to be taking a peek at the New Year's episode of Hyouka. We begin the episode En Meteor Res, notable because this is the only example of that in the entire 22 episode run, which gives a nice sense of foreboding in regard to the current predicament when we jump back to the events that got us there. The opening shot is almost like an opportunity for our eyes to get adjusted to the darkness inside this shed. And the following shots avoid showing the characters' eyes, which get us to focus on their signs of cold. Red nose, clutching hands, visible breath, and also get us really close to the characters, implying that they're cramped in here with a ton of junk. Chitanda's I'm curious is foreshadowed by her eyes in frame. The following shot building in a bit of space as Hotaro tries to avoid that gaze and similarly avoids the question. Chitanda foreshadows that Hotaro drew a bad fortune as we return to that close proximity, left aligned, right aligned, before finally seeing the shed that they're trapped in. As we jump back to the day before, Chitanda calling to invite Hotaro to the shrine, I always get a laugh out of him saying that Mayaka probably looks bad in a shrine outfit, and Chitanda quickly chastising him. The focus on Hotaro's feet as they talk allows for this scene, whereas Chitanda says she wants to show off her kimono, we zoom in as he slowly stops rubbing his feet before we zoom way out to him facing away. This was likely designed so that we're left to imagine what kind of reaction Hotaro has on his face, which in turn leads to a nice bit of delayed gratification, and also makes Chitanda's statement personal to the two of them as opposed to their larger friend group. I love the color palette provided by the lighting as Hotaro waits outside the shrine, even as he doesn't recognize Chitanda until she turns and says his name. Either that or is so enraptured by her that he can't say anything, as we go through similar frame blending and mystical echoing effects that are standard for his visualizations. It's a nice callback to many previous episodes, but the steps echoing makes me think of their first meeting in episode 1 specifically. The walk up to the shrine serves as a reminder of the difference between Hotaro and Chitanda in terms of familial obligation and status, and that even as their days were wildly different, so too is what they're doing right now. Chitanda is here representing her family, while Hotaro is there to socialize. This is the actualization of what had been previously set up in earlier episodes. Before this, the social divide really only impacted the settings of where their homes were and a bit of their personal outlook. But here we're seeing a lot of the differences in action from the way that they act and what's expected of them. We hear this in dialogue as Chitanda gives over the bottle of sake to the shrine, a great conversation with Kaho where we're explicitly shown how out of his depth Hotaro is. Given that Kaho and Eru are both members of the Rising Powers families, as Satoshi called them in the first episode, I really appreciate the brief glimpse of what Chitanda is like with someone she's been friends with for quite a while, who has similar familial responsibilities. Them being on the same wavelength as to the jokes at Hotaro's expense is a great example of that. The brief interlude with Mayaka, setting up the mystery's mechanism, also notably gets a laugh from me as Hotaro's face darkens upon drawing misfortune. We knew it was coming, something that makes his prayer at the shrine about wanting to be easy on his energy reserves even funnier in hindsight. And as Hotaro and Chitanda make their way inevitably towards being trapped in the shed, Hotaro's imagined reaction to his mistake darkens the shed even more in the aftermath. The same pans that we used at the start of the episode are then used again at the midway point, so we're informed through shot selection that we've now caught up to the opening scene. And what follows is another very clear example of the different societies that Hotaro and Chitanda live in, with them unable to yell for help because of the implication combined with Chitanda being at the shrine representing her father. Hotaro states that he'll never really understand it, but what I find really endearing about this sequence is that when Chitanda realizes that they don't have their cell phones, she says that Hotaro should shout because his health is more important than her familial duty. And Hotaro values Chitanda's feelings more than his own health, as he declares that a last resort. But that last resort's looking like a necessary one, as Hotaro's other 4 ideas have Chitanda getting more flustered in each one, as though in the real world her reaction just became more soured. But perfectly timed, and thanks to Chitanda's enhanced senses, they realize that they can convey a message to Mayaka using dropped items that will hopefully lead her to the shed to save them. Of course, neither the handkerchief nor the wallet are enough. With the 2 characters getting colder and colder, Hotaro realizes that they should probably just call for help, but true to his perseverance and hatred of giving up once he started something, he wants to avoid that outcome, responding to Chitanda's statement of it being her fault for dragging him with her by saying,
わがままじゃない。責任だろう。
アレキさんを巻き込んだ言い訳にはなりません。
which is consistent with what we know about Chitanda. Her desire to avoid putting responsibility or expectations on people in both the Sekitani June arc and Festival arcs, respectively. She never wants to be a burden to anyone, which explains her work ethic, and Hotaro is a good counterbalance to her. Not in terms of him being a burden, but in taking on some of her burdens, even when she doesn't ask. Grabbing the sake bottle on the walk up and tagging along to help carry the containers being good examples from this episode alone. His innate helpfulness manifests in being useful to Chitanda, and it's in part why they work really well together as a pair. Indeed, that trait of his coming around again as Chitanda mentions that Satoshi is likely at the shrine, giving Hotaro the answer to their problem. So let's talk about the mystery. If you look at the sequence from the perspective of how do they get out of the shed, then you'll probably agree with me that this mystery is pretty whatever. The mechanism is straightforward, which is fine, leaving the question of how do they convey the message as the critical element. The movie having the solution, Hotaro and Satoshi both having seen the film that features this anecdote about a bag tied at both ends, leaves a sour taste in my mouth. And maybe that's because as a foreigner, I wouldn't know this story about Nobunaga's brother-in-law's betrayal, which could be relatively well known in Japan, or at least something the average person would have heard of. Based on the data given during the episode, the film being the piece that brings it all together makes structural sense, and is a possible deduction regardless of cultural knowledge. I simply dislike not having the means to go that extra step to the conclusion. But I think that's the wrong way to look at this mystery. Rather, we need to invert perspective to Satoshi and Mayaka, who are receiving the clues. Hotaro is giving the hints and leaving it to those 2 to put the pieces together. And thus it's not Hotaro who's solving the mystery, but Satoshi. And that, thematically, is awesome, because it's Hotaro trusting his friend's deductive reasoning capabilities after a huge arc where Satoshi was doubting himself. You could say that this is proof that Satoshi can be a Sherlockian, but I think that might be a bridge too far given of how much of a layup this is. But hey, confidence has got to start somewhere. And I love that aspect of this mystery, I just wish that it worked on both levels, as opposed to really only being engaging on a thematic one. But with that, as Satoshi opens the door and the shed fills with light, a nice change for our eyes, we're reminded of Hotaro's misfortune yet again. Sappy New Year, the opening quote of repeating what you do on New Year's again and again, a reminder that more mysteries and curiosity will ensue, and as Chitanda sneezes, we pan up to the moon to end the episode. Episode 20 is great setup for the final 2 episodes, the affirmation of several things we've come to learn about these characters over the last 19 videos, and gives some insight into some of our favorite characters. But what's really amazing about Hyoka is how it usually balances these things, all the while having really interesting mysteries on a structural level. And the lack of that second pillar makes this, by all accounts, a great episode, one of the weaker ones in the show. But frankly, if episode 20 had to be a bit weaker to make episode 21 the majestic beast it is, it was totally worth it. Because next time we talk about Hyoka, we're taking a look at my favorite episode in the second half of the show. But until then, hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.